Good evening. Welcome back. You remember that those of you who were here last week, and we had a good crowd last week, but the weather was even worse then because it was so hard to get around. So, you won't have to have written excuses if you weren't here last week. But if you weren't, you missed Ambassador Christopher Hill talking about what would be required in order to have a successful summit for denuclear arrangements. And one of the things that really was that stuck in my mind that he mentioned was that the signed agreement, the agreement would be negotiated a week or 10 days or so ahead of time, and then the two principals in a negotiation could talk about their golf game or what they wanted for dessert in their post-conference banquet where they would be celebrating with champagne. And that with the agreement already written a week or so ahead of time, it would only be the signing that would remain. I understand that this morning Chris Hill was on MSNBC, and he essentially reiterated some of the same things he told us before the this conference between Kim and Trump, and mentioned many of the same things in his MSNBC conversation that he told us. I wanted to mention that I know people have had some trouble getting to our talks that are supposed to be on our website, but that is being taken care of. And Shedid Sait will tell us exactly how to do that. But that we know that Chris Hill's talk, the one he gave last week, will be available on YouTube within several days. So if you have friends or acquaintances, or you need to see it again, by all means do that. But it was refreshing to have him tell us ahead of time what would happen with the conference, essentially. Announcements today by Shedid.
Thank you, Dick. So Dick has already welcomed you. I've add my welcome to you for the 35th annual lecture series on the Korean Peninsula, past, present, and future. My name is Shedid Sait, and I'm a member of the Winter Lecture Series Planning Committee. The Winter Lecture Series is sponsored by the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church, and we also partner with OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute program. This program is funded in part by Humanities Nebraska and Nebraska Cultural Endowment. This year, we have 6 lectures. Tonight's lecture by Professor Nan Kim is our 4th. Our 5th is next week by Professor Stephen Wills of Nebraska Wesleyan University. He will draw on years worth of experience teaching about the legacy of Japanese imperialism and wartime atrocities, the complex influence of US involvement in the region, and the fraught politics of collective memory. All the lectures are announced on OLLI's Friday Happenings newsletter and will be available on the Unitarian Church's website. There have been several inquiries recently about how to access the information on our website, and I thought I'll take a minute to explain this to you. So let me just not that one, that one. Unitarian, okay. So you go with the UnitarianLincoln.org, which is our main web page. And if you scroll down in church calendar, you will see the Winter Lecture Series. You click on that, and that brings you to the Winter Lecture Series page. And you can scan this and you'd find that there are many links here that you can explore at your own leisure. But I would like to point in particular to the YouTube channel link, which if you click, should bring you to the lectures that have already been uploaded at our website. And you'd see that we already have the Parks-Coble lecture. Let me see if I can make this smaller. Yeah. So the first lecture is already up. And within, I don't know Brandon what his schedule is, but within a short time, we will have the other lectures also up, okay? So any questions? You can get to this previous page. That was the Winter Lecture Series web page, sorry. Winter Lecture Series web page, which is this one here. You can also do it just Google search for Unitarian Lincoln Winter Lecture Series, and that would bring you directly to this page, okay? So that is, if you still have questions, just stop me after the presentation and I'll help you. If bad weather ever seems to threaten a need to cancel a lecture, you will find the notice of cancellation at this website on the front page. As always, we'll use the usual pattern, which is to have about 50 to 55 minutes of lecture, followed by 15 minutes of refreshments, and followed by Q&A. Although the refreshments are available at the break time, are donated by the volunteers of the Unitarian Church, you are encouraged to leave $1 or $2 or $5 or whatever pleases you in the basket provided for this purpose. Your donations will help support the Winter Lecture Series to continue for several years to come. At this time, I'd like to thank the volunteers who work behind the scenes to make the refreshments possible. They donate food, do the setup, and clean up afterwards. I'd like them to stand up and be recognized as I read their names. If you are here, please stand up. Jackie Kale, Jackie and Bob Egan, Amy Berkey, Becky Sate, Dory Bush, I think they're all back there, Patty Kubas, Karen Dinspear, Tanya Haig, Rich Little, and Rick Goodman. And there's a request from that committee that after the break, please don't bring your cups or glasses into this room. And final announcement is please quiet your cell phones at this time. And then I'm going to switch hats and introduce our speaker for today. Nan Kim is Associate Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she is also Director of the Public History Program. She's originally from New York City and received her PhD in Cultural Anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley. Her bachelor's degree is in English Literature from Princeton University. Today, Professor Kim will talk about the cultural dimensions of national division and other Korean War legacies with a focus on the issue of separated families. She recently published the book, Memory, Reconciliation, and Reunions in South Korea, Crossing the Divide. She has brought several copies of the book here for sale at $30 each, which is a deep discount over the published price. You can pay in cash. She tells me that people have also been able to pay via Google Pay. Professor Kim will be happy to sign your copy of the book. In this book and her other work, Professor Kim provides cultural interpretation and historical perspective on contemporary events in Korea that can otherwise be difficult for a broader audience to understand. Events such as the 2010 Korean military crisis, the 2016-17 candlelight protest movement, and the impeachment of the former President Park Geun-hye. Nan Kim serves on the editorial boards of 3 publications: Critical Asian Studies, Public History and Museum, and the Seoul Journal of Korean Studies. Her research interests are broad and include dissent movements, peace activism, transnational public history, environmental humanities, and the history of the emotions. Her outreach work includes serving on the steering committee of the International Peace Organization, Women Cross DMZ, which she represented as a delegate to the 2018 Vancouver Women's Forum organized by the Nobel Women's Initiative. I think with that, I'd like to invite you to present. Okay, let me. Okay. We'll start the slideshow here. Yeah. Okay.
If you have one, that would be great. Otherwise, I can just use the. Good evening. Thank you, all of you, for coming out tonight for this lecture, and many thanks to the Winter Lecture Series Committee for organizing this a series of events and for inviting me to speak with you. I join you at the end of a week when Korea has been very much in the headlines, notably for the setback of the US DPRK summit in Hanoi, which, as you all know, ended abruptly without an agreement. And that was an enormous disappointment and the loss of a critical opportunity for those who have been. Thank you. I see. Good. Thank you. Oh. It's all right. I can just do it. Thank you. Okay. As you were, I think, had been anticipating, particularly because you've been studying this issue, there has the agreement, the lack of agreement meant that there would be no establishment of liaison offices or lifting of sanctions or important steps toward denuclearization, and no peace declaration. And so there are, of course, different opinions, but in terms of being able to achieve more conditions to overcome this impasse of the state of the recurring crises, it was really regarded as a critical loss of an opportunity. And I understand much of the rest of your winter lecture series in Korea have dealt with aspects of international history and diplomatic relations. And I welcomed your invitation to address the cultural side of understanding the situation in Korea. But I also knew that I would be speaking in the wake of this week's summit, whatever the outcome would be. So what I'd like to do is to reframe our understanding of summit diplomacy when it comes to the peace process surrounding the Korean Peninsula. So how can we think of this process in more cultural and historical terms within a time frame that spans at least several decades, if not far longer, rather than focusing on the events of the past week or several months or the past year? And that, I believe, would help to better understand why efforts toward ending the war have been prioritized or have been also proceeded at the pace that they have within the two Koreas, in contrast to as we're seeing now, this more uneven peace and awareness on the quarters of the U.S. So South Korea has become, has been and will also become more involved again as a mediator in terms of as the aftermath of the failed summit in Vietnam. And this highlights the important role of South Korea. And in this case, with respect to inter-Korea peace building, it's important to consider the various conditions of possibility. And in particular, this is an important time to think about the conditions that led to the current political configuration. Namely the Candlelight Revolution of 2016-2017. So because you've been part of this series, I think you've been well-oriented as far as this part of the world. And in terms of considering the change over the last year from fire and fury and the threatening to be on the brink of war to this renewed emphasis on diplomacy and engagement with the North, that there have been interrelated components, the emphasis on North Korea on economic development, the reconciliation between the two Koreas, which has allowed South Korea to take this critical role as a mediator and also really foregrounding the diplomatic process. And then, of course, the U.S. role, which is a departure from past convention and this unusual investment on the part of Trump in the summit diplomacy, which, as we see, has its limits. So all three have been critical for what has transpired. But in terms of trying to understand the South Korean part of the equation, this would all not have been possible if Moon Jae-in did not, the current South Korean president had not come into office, and that requires an understanding of the context of the candlelight protests, now called the Candlelight Revolution, because it marked this change of power from the last government. So what has been called the Candlelight Revolution refers to the massive public demonstrations that culminated in the impeachment and removal from power of former President Park Geun-hye, and this scandal that brought about, thank you, that response involved this far-reaching influence peddling scandal, and that was really what triggered a protest movement to coalesce and tap into what was already widespread political discontent and simmering outrage about the unresponsiveness of that past government. And so particularly during that time, there had been this steady regression of hard-won political gains for Korea's struggle for democratization since the 1980s. And with the suppression, particularly of all forms of dissent, this was explained in terms of the need for asserting national security. Any challenges to the government, including continuing calls for investigation by into the ferry disaster that occurred 2014, where you had over 300 students who had died, the Sewol ferry disaster. So as activists at the time raised their demands to address issues of inequality and this lack of responsiveness, they'd be routinely painted as communists under the logic that any form of protest would disturb the social order and thereby could help the North in this condition of division. So the candlelight protests began in late October of 2016 and continued for 17 consecutive weeks, growing from hundreds of thousands in the initial weeks and eventually numbering an estimated 2.3 million participants in simultaneous demonstrations across the country at the movement's height in midwinter. So you can relate in this freezing weather, people being out on the street for hours at a time, week after week. And though predominantly youthful, these participants in the weekly Saturday rallies really came from a cross-section of society, a diverse range of age groups and backgrounds, including many who had never participated in protests before. And as these energetic and well-organized these mass protests occurred, this draws upon a long tradition of a very vibrant protest culture, as well as the fact that these protests were not a toppling of a government. It was really bringing pressure on democratic institutions. And so these protests really emerged alongside a very methodical, rule-bound working of these democratic institutions. And so this cascade of events led to the eventual National Assembly vote in December of 2016 that called for Park's impeachment. And that vote, which again was an overwhelming vote, it did not immediately result in Park's being ousted from government. It was a suspension of presidential powers, and the final decision was in the hands of the Constitutional Court. So this is all to say that it wasn't this sort of mob rule. What happened was that the final decision was subject to this 3-month process of judicial review that was required to confirm that the National Assembly members had followed due process in the impeachment proceedings. So there's a sense of suspense and limbo, and during this period, there were ongoing revelations by the independent media coverage of a widening corruption scandal that involved, again, cronyism and far-ranging in terms of offenses. And this sank Park's public approval ratings to, at one point, a low of 4%. And so you had this near consensus among the electorate that she was unfit to serve as president. But at the time, the country's constitutional court was dominated by conservatives who were directly or indirectly beholden to Park. And so there remained the possibility that even after all of this, all of the protests, all of the investigations, there still was the chance that she would be returned to office. And so, you know, that has that sense of uncertainty. It's largely lost today, but I remember this vividly in terms of talking to people of what would happen if she's actually restored to power. What does all of this mean then in terms of the expression of popular will? So when the Constitutional Court justices finally appeared in a live national broadcast on March 10th of 2017 to reveal the verdict, there was a debate as to what the split would be in terms of, you know, they had to have a supermajority, right? But when the verdict was announced, it went against all predictions because they, in fact, voted unanimously and in favor of upholding the impeachment. So Park, therefore, unequivocally lost her presidential powers and immunity from prosecution, and through a snap election in May, the center-left candidate, Moon Jae-in, came to power, as the new president, holding a strong anti-corruption mandate in response to this overwhelmingly widespread popular sentiment in favor of thorough political change. So the context of this is also the understanding that this, you know, again, far-reaching corruption scandal had been enabled because of this emphasis on, again, of suppressing different forms of dissent and allowing the abuse of power in that context. So another resource that can be, so this in terms of the reversals of these different administrations, we'll think back that this is a time that harks back to the earlier Sunshine period, which I'll talk about later in my talk. But you had two center-left administrations, followed by two conservative, and Moon Jae-in coming to power in 2017. So another resource that's hard to grasp in the West is that the very long sense of history among Koreans. It's very far extended sense of historical consciousness, and you can see this timeline. It might be difficult to read, but it's directly, this again, far-reaching sense of the historical past relates to the fact that Korea goes so far back in time and as a state. And so much so that had division not been imposed in 1945, Korea could claim one of the longest histories in the world among modern nations as a political entity within relatively stable territorial borders. And that with the unified state in Korea dating back over 1,000 years to at least the 10th century. So you can see, I don't have a pointer here, but generally when we talk about division and the 20th century as one that, of course, was devastating in terms of the fratricidal war, often the narrative goes back to the colonial period, but I really would argue that you need to go back much further in time in order to understand other resources that exist as far as the resilience of the prior, in terms of Korea as a state, having had this long history as a unified state. So largely in response to the incursions of Western imperialism into the region in the 19th century, one of the responses was Japan's drive to modernize internally. I think you'll be hearing more about this next week. And eventually, the Japanese oligarchs resolved to colonize Korea. And so this colonial occupation by Japan it's the annexation again, and colonization, 1910, colonization, the colonial period going from 1910 to 1945, ends with Japan's defeat at the end of World War II, the war in the Pacific. But almost immediately after liberation, Korea was divided by the Allies against the wishes of nearly all Koreans, resulting in these two zones divided along the 38th parallel and administered by the U.S. in the south and the USSR in the north. So, after World War II, in other words, it can be seen as something of a historical anomaly that Korea was divided. So why was Korea divided and not Japan as one of the aggressors? Korea, after all, had been victimized by colonization. And in contrast, in Europe, of course, Germany as the aggressor in World War II had its own territory divided. So that is a question, again, that comes to mind as far as why things turned out so differently in Northeast Asia. And that really goes back to the fact that Japan was really, Japan being the only non-Western empire, and with Japan at its center, Douglas MacArthur, right, had been planning for years to occupy Japan, therefore effectively replacing Japan with the U.S. as regional hegemon. And so the occupation of Korea was basically an afterthought. And so that with the tensions between, after the, again, the end of World War II, you essentially have a condition where between the leaders on both sides, you had a polarization in terms of the US-occupied South and the USSR occupied North. So eventually these escalated into the, culminating with the formation of the two republics in 1948. And so the outbreak of civil war in 1950, again, you'll hear more from Bruce Cummings next in the future in your last lecture, but this quickly turns into an international war when the conflict becomes a confrontation that drew in the major Cold War adversaries, particularly, of course, the US and China, with all sides vying for control over the Korean Peninsula as a key crossroads of Northeast Asia. So truly, as Bruce Cummings notes, the estimated number of civilian casualties in the Korean War represents a soberingly high proportion. Among the war's more than 4 million casualties, at least half are believed to have been civilians. So a greater percentage than either World War II or Vietnam. So after the major hostilities were suspended with the armistice in 1953, negotiations for peace treaty broke down amid these growing Cold War tensions, and hence we have the unended state of the war. So, I mean, that had been a central question for myself. I actually was born in New York City in the US, and had not expected to pursue Korean studies when I was younger. But when I was in college, I'd studied with two former war journalists. I had the chance to study with Jonathan Schell and also Gloria Emerson, and both of them, because of their, again, deep humanistic, their commitments and their really inspiring, I think, their vision really for, I had myself, I think, rethought a lot of what I would do in the future. I had previously been planning to be study medieval Italian literature, and instead I completely changed my life, and I interned at the Village Voice, and I became an English major and worked for a while as a journalist. So, but then after a time, I decided to go back to graduate school so that I could really focus on Korea, and that was really a central question as far as why Korea was divided, and also how the division affects the lives of ordinary people, because. While I was working as a kind of cub journalist, it was in northern New Jersey, in the area where I grew up, and that was a time of the nuclear crisis in 1994. And one of my assignments was to go out and to interview members of the Korean American community, because there's a large Korean American community there. And I was really struck by the division within, again, people who go to church together or who are in the, living in the same community, but had starkly different interpretations. So that made me very interested in again, understanding more about these continuing legacies that also extend out into the diaspora. So the hope, of finally ending the state of war on the Korean Peninsula is, again, a sentiment that is reflected, as I mentioned, in terms of that you see in terms of the current political climate, where a vast majority of South Koreans want to see an end to the 68-year Korean War. And a survey in the month following the Panmunjom summit found, again, over 88% of South Koreans supporting that April 27th joint declaration. And so, again, you have the following the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore last June, the reaction in South Korea was one of relief and celebration, and shortly thereafter also Moon Jae-in's party rode to a landslide victory in local elections. So while South Koreans celebrated a historic step in ending the Korean War, the Western media and again, observers in the U.S. and elsewhere reacted with alarm and again, notably the response among the liberal media in the U.S. was and continues to be highly critical. And so while this, in terms of thinking about this marked difference in perceptions of this peace effort, of these ongoing peace efforts, for one thing, among Koreans, this process has not simply been another episode in the Donald Trump show, and the meaning of the Singapore Agreement is not primarily about Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, even though there's been this emphasis on this personal diplomacy, and clearly we're seeing its limits as well. And of course, within South Korea, the agreement between the DPRK and the US has been instrumental for allowing other related breakthroughs to occur in terms of, for example, demilitarizing parts of the DMZ or trying to reconnect the rail link. But rather, the priority has been to bring an end to the war, not only because of peace for its own sake, but because of the understanding that it's this continued enmity of unended war that's been at the root of these recurring crises in the region, and how it also has been used domestically as a pretext to enable forms of often either repression or, again, what I'd mentioned earlier in terms of the connection with corruption as well. So this discrepancy between US and Korean views on the peace process is highly revealing. Given this critical role played by South Korea, it points also to this striking contrast in the way that the U.S., that South Korea is understood in the West. So on the one hand, we're also, your group has been studying Korea at a moment where culturally, South Korea has been, again, has brought to a higher profile than in recent memory. In some ways, culturally, it's become completely mainstream, particularly the appeal of contemporary pop culture. Witness this phenom of the South Korean boy band, which BTS, which the other uncertainty was whether it would sell out the Wembley Stadium, which it managed to do in a matter of 2 hours. So on the one hand, it's very culturally accessible, where you have a number of these other, whether it's film or these serial, what they call dramas or television productions. For those who are watching Kingdom on Netflix. On the other hand, politically, when it comes to issues such as reconciliation with North Korea, these political dynamics among South Koreans can be baffling or hard to understand. So I'm going to try to bring these two sides together in terms of thinking of some of the cultural expressions and political sentiments by having us look more closely at a music video from 2004. Even though it's a little dated, or it is rather dated by Korean standards, it has attracted attention more recently because of its content. So it features a song that was composed by Choi Jun-young. It's called When That Day Comes, 그날이 오면. And this was part of a high-profile collaboration called Love, Unification, Desire Project. And this was the most heavily promoted song out of what became an album. It was sponsored by the Korea Entertainment Producers Association, and with proceeds of these album sales going toward humanitarian food aid for North Korean children. So as the project's lead song, When That Day Comes, features over 40 popular South Korean recording artists and groups. And these included some of the most sought-after K-pop stars and music celebrities of the time. And on the same album, another version of this lead song was performed by the coloratura soprano Sumi Jo. And so again, this is an indication of the fact that this was not a fringe effort by any means. It was very much a high profile and mainstream production. So let's turn to that video. And so here is also, just in terms of another image from the book, as far as civilians being caught in the crossfire. This was an image that was taken by David Douglas Duncan, who's also known for a number of portraits of Picasso, but he was a Korean war photographer as well. And he just passed away last year. So as you'll see from the video, there's this interspersing between contemporary scenes and archival images from the war. The video that
This is right here.
there we go, thank you. Oops, so that just said June. It said June 25th, 1950, and then just and ...
이제 만나야만 한다. 서운한 마음은 모두 잊자. 우리는 하나니까.
우리의 소원은 단 하나, 다시 만나야만 한다. 너와 나 두 손 꼭 잡고서 기쁜 노래를 부르자.
모두가 기다리고 있다. 우리 다시 만날 그날. 기쁨과 행복의 눈물로 세상 가득한 그날을. 그리움 백두산 산새 소리 한라산이 춤을 출 때 가슴에 맺혔던 내 발품이 이제야 녹는구나. 우리의 소원은 단 하나, 다시 만나야만 한다. 너와 나 두 손 꼭 잡고서 기쁜 노래를 부르자. 종일 노래를
Okay, so see if I can get back to my slides. Okay. All right, so in the video you saw how the brief cameos of the music celebrities were interwoven with images from the Korean War, including an elderly woman bending down to lift the shroud off of the face of a corpse, to try to identify, find someone who is missing, as well as a glimpse of headstones, right, in filling a graveyard. So both these scenes suggest the staggering toll of war deaths, and soon thereafter follows a succession of these handshakes at inter-Korean high-level meetings in 4 shots spanning nearly 2 decades, beginning in 1972. So from that point, midway through the song, the cascade of sweeping developments tracking a half-century of Korea's history of national division gives way to a focus on essentially a single moment in time, as nearly all the remaining archival photographs for the rest of the video were taken within the span of an hour on the single evening of August 15th, 2000. And that was the first day of the reunions of separated families families who've been separated between North and South Korea, in an event that brought together two civilian delegations, one from Seoul and another from Pyongyang, to meet in a series of events over 4 days, some private, some public. The initial meetings were it wasn't public in the sense that it was still closed, except to the press and members of the Red Cross who were supporting, and other, the staffers from both sides. But it was on, perhaps some of you saw this on CNN. It was within Korea's saturation coverage, and also it was covered in the international media. And what this was is a simultaneous exchange in which you had 100 North Koreans come to Seoul and 100 South Koreans fly to Pyongyang, with each participant meeting with a small handful of family members over the course of 4 days. And these reunions were regarded as the first concrete outcome of the historic first Inter-Korean Summit that took place in June of that year. That was the first meeting between the two Korean heads of state since the separate republics were established in 1948. And so the agreement that came out of the summit was the June 15th Joint Declaration. And that would become this hallmark of what is known in South Korea, or as Kim Dae-jung's Sunshine Policy. And that marked this unprecedented departure from the prior official position that had long opposed or attempted to contain North Korea, that had the official position of enmity. And so instead, the Sunshine Policy pursued a new inter-Korean approach based on this engagement, emphasizing dialogue, mutual recognition, economic cooperation, and peaceful reconciliation. So the reunions then of separated families took place on August 15th. That's National Liberation Day on both Koreas. And they carried heavy political significance because chronologically it was not only the first tangible outcome, as they said at the time, but also involving civilians from both sides. The South Korean officials described the successful accomplishment of the reunions as a prerequisite to fulfilling other aspects of this agenda of economic cooperation, anticipating these events to serve as a sign that other aspects of the Joint Declaration could be taken in good faith. And I spoke with an advisor, an economic advisor in the Kim Dae-jung administration at the time, and because there was a sense that they couldn't just go forward, it would be too crass to just move forward with economic cooperation. They had to address the legacy of the war, and also because there had been, the popular will was one that prioritized that this had to, even though this was a token gesture at the time, they needed to make progress or demonstrate progress toward this issue. And so, given that prior attempts to hold these similar reunions had been thwarted several times in past decades, even after official agreements had been signed, there was this air of suspense as to whether the meetings would happen at all. And in South Korea, the television ratings actually proved higher because out of curiosity as far as how the family members would interact with each other and whether the reunions would occur. The television ratings would prove higher for the family meetings than for the June summit coverage itself. In the sense that I remember people wondering how the North Koreans would interact. And there was a good amount of popular speculation in the run-up to this broadcast whether they would be, basically assumed they would be really hardened communists and appear as sort of stereotypical apparatchiks, using the events for mostly a vehicle for propaganda. But the meetings instead would, by now you've probably seen some of the coverage or images that circulated from these and subsequent reunions. The meetings would generate these searing images of raw human emotion, these intimate expressions of affection in scenes where the mutual resemblances among the participating families were unmistakable. And so our perception of these meetings as ones that are highly, again, these very wrenching kind of or heartbreaking reunions, that was not necessarily the perception prior to these August events. And part of that is because there had been one prior precedent, and that occurred in 1985, which again is the height of the Cold War. And there had been also, again, it was much smaller in scale, and because of, you saw more political grandstanding at the time, and then after one round, basically the negotiations broke down, and so there had not been another repeat. And also at the time, there were also family members who did not want to come out to participate because they felt that there was too much political risk to expose that you had a family member who was from the other side. So in order to prepare for the reunions, they involved both Red Cross societies, the DPRK and the South Korean Red Cross. There had been, well, let me mention that culturally, the touchstone was really the KBS telethon, which is only happened within South Korea, but that happened in 1983, where you had it was only supposed to be 90 minutes long, where there was again another commemoration of the war, and people came and showed signs of family members that they were looking for. And because of the groundswell of response, they couldn't end the program, and it just continued on for months, and it resulted in over 100,000 people finding each other. And so, you know, the difficulty was that if you were in a divided country and somebody went missing during the war, it was again sensitive to just try to seek for that person because they could be on the other side of the border, and that's the same was also true in North Korea. So that's why you had this stasis. So all of the families who participated in that KBS telethon were in South Korea, but they couldn't find each other. Some were even just in the next village. So this idea of diaspora doesn't necessarily mean that they are scattered across different distances. It's just that they weren't able to contact each other. Also, children who got lost may have been illiterate, or there had been prior campaigns to find them in the newspaper, but they didn't have the same impact as in 1983. They had this split screen technology so that people could confirm at the studio and tell stories of trying to find each other. And so it was very emotional. And so when the, in 2000, there was another scene that was comparable to this in terms of finding the people who had been essentially lost all these decades since the Korean War. So in order to find the participants in this reunion, remember the June summit happens in June of 2000, just only 2 months later, they're trying to hold the reunion. So they had to find all of 100 people from either side might not sound like a lot, but what was not understood was that the list that the South sent were those who were essentially former war refugees. So it's kind of like if you think about the Cuban Americans in Miami, right? Very anti-communist. Generally, is how they're identified as a population, and then there was prior to the June summit, really speculation as to whether North Korea would agree to these reunions because it would be, involving a population that is more marginalized in North Korea. But what happened and what was not expected was that North Korea also sent a list of those who wanted to participate or were going to participate in the reunions, and these were people who had, during the war, had disappeared and had come from the South to North Korea. So what that meant was that they sent a list in advance of those who, what became clear was these were people who had been missing since the war, those who had been essentially the presumed war dead. You had lists that were published in major South Korean newspapers or on broadcast. They had these sort of breaking news reports. here was the scene from at the Red Cross, that if you saw your name on the television, the little chyron, or on these lists on television or in the newspaper, people came to the center of Seoul, to the Red Cross headquarters, because they wanted to see the application that was sent from North Korea, because there was so much uncertainty. It's been 50 years. People had been searching or waiting for news for years and then decades, and at a certain point they had to give up. And so to receive after all this time, it was really shocking. So you had, again, either those who lived in Seoul or people from the provinces might send a relative to come down to, particularly to see there was a little photograph that was on, as you can see from on the application. And even though it had been obviously photocopied a number of times, just to see that grainy photograph, it was really, I think that what made the greatest impression, to realize that people, I had been doing my field work there, and there had various, mostly elderly people who were coming to see, and they might not have had their name on the list, but they were just, they were also looking for missing family members. And suddenly someone had said, "He's alive!" And it was, again, all of the reporters around had surrounded him taking photographs, because, again, it had been so long, and until he saw the photograph, that he didn't believe that his brother would still be alive. So how did these families become separated? These meetings in English have been called separated family reunions, in Korean 이상가족 상봉, and this term of dispersed family, 이상가족, or separated family, has come to stand for those who were separated since the 1950-1953 period of the Korean War. This wide-scale separation of family members largely resulted from these temporary domestic migrations. People either fled from the fighting or they were conscripted. And during, as some of you may already know, the fiercely embattled period during the first year of the war, Seoul changed hands 4 times, and as did nearly all the territory on the peninsula, at least once during the war. And so this displacement would later unexpectedly become permanent interstate relocations, when the border later became impassable to citizens on either side. And so those who temporarily relocated during the chaos of the war could never have expected that what was sort of a provisional internal migration would eventually amount to indefinite exile from their places of origin. And so after the border was sealed near the 38th parallel, following the signing of the armistice on July 1953, for an ordinary citizen to attempt making private contact with anyone on the other side was an offense punishable by imprisonment, and this is in both Koreas. And that meant that hundreds of thousands of Koreans were unable to learn the fates of their family members and relatives. And in the case of the participants in these reunions, they were not only physically separated from each other, they were essentially lost to each other since the early 1950s. So this differs from, let's say, the divided Germany, where members of the families could write to each other, they could call each other on the phone, occasionally meet, but this was complete loss of contact. So it meant that people following the war were unable to sort the living from the dead, a crucial post-conflict process, arrested by national division. And so the subtitle of my book is Crossing the Divide. And the phrase not only refers to a territorial crossing, but also the passage essentially from death to life, and the crossing of these sensitive social boundaries, in the sense that many of those who could not be traced were mourned as dead, whether out of genuine resignation because the scale of mass death was so enormous during the war, but also because of the social risks attached to having relatives on the other side. So nearly all the individuals selected to participate in the reunions were those who had been given up for dead since the Korean War. And that was those who reappeared during this time. So as hundreds of people resurfaced, it unsettled the very meaning of war death, right? Because after the normalization of relations between China and South Korea, there were other means to find out news about missing family members. And so there was a kind of flurry of people who were able to receive some contact. They might be able to meet in a third country, often China. But for this group, they were those who had completely no contact at all. So that was a general shock, which is, again, from this, even if these people can come forward to find their family, then things must really be changing. So it was a sense of the concrete for ordinary people, what the implications of being able to overcome the war itself. So prior to 2000, the dilemma of this inter-Korean separated families was perceived to be important, but relatively marginal in the sense that it was perceived to have affected a small fraction of the overall Korean population. Yet virtually every Korean lost a relative or family member during the chaos and devastation of the Korean War, including countless deaths in which bodies could not be reclaimed. And so it was a shocking development that for South Koreans to learn that North Korea had sent information about so many of the presumed dead, including several that had held positions that were prominent within North Korean society, which also explains why they wouldn't be able to make contact sooner, because they did not want to bring any any type of harm to or discrimination against their own family in the North. So as scores upon scores of people who had long been counted among the dead were in fact discovered to be alive in the North, suddenly there arose this possibility that nearly any Korean family could prove to be a South Korean separated family. And this, again, has the potential to shake basic assumptions about your family identity, your personal history, and your sense of self. So in this way, the reunions also indirectly recalled the war's catastrophic toll of mass death, particularly given the fact that you had such a high death toll among civilians. But the bitter reality of this is that what has been called the Korean War against civilians, the fact that so many civilians had died, was a sort of taboo subject through the suppression of ordinary people's narratives by dominant Cold War interpretations on both sides. So it has only been in recent years that there's been an emphasis on trying to reclaim some of the traumatic side of the history of the Korean War. So this emphasis on the social suffering that was shared and emphasized at the heart of these reunions is something that can't be taken for granted. So the book really examines the reunions as part of a complex process of national reconciliation that was undertaken between the two states at the cusp of the 21st century, when you had ordinary people coming to grips with the everyday consequences that were continuing of events that occurred in wartime half a century earlier. So this was this is a mother meeting with a son, and the image of these mother-son reunions, again, that shows also the kind of gender dimension. So the irony of this is because those who had ended up on the North, whether out of volition or by happenstance, following the war with the consolidation of an anti-communist state within South Korea, they became not only themselves kind of vilified, but their families were subject to, again, stigmatization, put under investigation. And so the sense was that, again, it was a very sensitive position, which is why so many people had hid their family histories. And the effort to find the families to participate was so difficult because people didn't come forward to claim. So, showing these kind of touching images really was reframing, again, the whole, this sense of this kind of relationship of those who had left behind families in the South. So, You know, in the months following the June summit, and it's a transformative moment in the history of inter-Korean reconciliation, these families effectively, these reunions effectively served as a joint North-South, the first North-South commemoration of the war. It was time to mark the anniversary of Korea's liberation from a Japanese colonial rule on August 15th of 1945. But the reunions in August of 2000 would open the space in which both North Koreans and South Koreans could remember the consequences in the Korean War in what effectively amounted to a commemoration that was centered on ordinary people as the victims, in the sense that prior to the two states proceeding with these terms of inter-Korean economic cooperation, the reunions afforded this means to recognize that staggering human devastation of the war. And particularly, there was a focus on events in Seoul because of the fact that there had been actually two simultaneous meetings that took place, one in Seoul and one in Pyongyang. But the events that took place in North Korea were much more restricted in terms of its media coverage. And so it meant that the press pool in Seoul and in the South Korea had far greater access. And the iconic images from these events, and those who were sort of raised to a level of being sort of celebrated in this process, were those who previously had never been recognized as separated families. They were invisible families. They were the families of those who somebody who went to the north. And so what this meant was that you had simultaneously the recognition that at a time when you had reconciliation between North and South, there was also a reckoning within South Korea of many of the excesses of the period during the military authoritarian era in South Korea. And so, in Seoul, what happened, the events centered on these families who, after decades of keeping silent or actively hiding their politically sensitive ties, they were propelled virtually overnight from the margins of South Korean society to a highly visible position at the center of these official and popular discourses on inter-Korean reconciliation. So this then, in terms of, I don't know if we'll have a chance to see this as the events that had taken place. I guess one thing I wanted to mention is that the circumstances at the time, this occurred, these overtures on the South came amidst a change in leadership in North Korea in 1998. That's when Kim Jong-il had fully assumed power after a period of transition following Kim Il-sung's death in 1998. And North Korea then it moved to overcome its isolation, trying to revitalize its economy and establish diplomatic ties with several countries in Western Europe and Southeast Asia. But the Sunshine Policy would continue in South Korea under the successor, Roh Moo-hyun, but then engagement was abandoned in 2008. When the conservative president, Lee Myung-bak, assumed the presidency, and they returned to a harder line toward North Korea. And at this time, North Korea also, the leadership was preoccupied with its own transition because of Kim Jong-il's poor health at the time. He suffered a stroke in August of 2008. And so it's, at this time, kind of retreated into survival mode. And the political changes that took place between 2008 and just last year had been characterized as part of this kind of rebordering in Korea between the two Koreas. So in terms of trying to understand some of the pendulum swings between it, that's some of the larger context. And despite the uncertainty and the setbacks, the reunions program would resume and continue, eventually allowing nearly 18,000 individuals to reconnect for the first time since 1953. So later rounds would no longer draw this widespread public interest. particularly in the face of the deterioration of the inter-Korean relationship prior to last year. And of the survivors, there are estimated about 132,000 people who have applied for the reunions, and more than half of them have passed away. With currently over 60% are in their 80s, and as the current situation continues, it's speculated that these reunions won't continue beyond this decade. So the fact that the later reunions occurred under more limited conditions, you should also not take away from this impact of these initial family meetings, in the sense that there was an unprecedented combination of conditions, the most favorable international climate to date in terms of the Korean peace process at the time, an unusually high level of domestic optimism toward reconciliation at the time, and the impact of the unexpected simultaneous resurfacing of these hundreds of people who presumed to have died. So, so that period also helped to generate a counter-narrative in popular memory that provided a break from the Cold War enmity of the past and offered an alternative path to reject that confrontation of a mutual war footing. I mean, in terms of thinking about the fact that it's Koreans who are living on the knife's edge of this brinkmanship, and why they would be supportive of the peace process. In some ways, one could imagine that they would be most at risk, and it's really with the recognition of the times in which the confrontation has been reduced, coincides again with these periods of engagement and diplomacy. So really regarding the months following the June summit and culminating in these reunions and its aftermath, there was this turning point in popular memory and cultural practice that contributed toward making reconciliation possible to imagine in a way had never been before, and that facilitated a political agency for the concrete changes in South Korea's inter-Korean policy that set the course for the ensuing decade of engagement from 1998 to 2008, and again, more recently, within the current political climate. So I think I'm going to wrap up so that, okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll take about 10 minutes of break and then come back.